Welcome to tonight's Ministers Forum. These forums were originally created to disseminate online science-based resources during the pandemic. And over the months, we expanded the vision to include community organizers, artists, scholars, religious leaders, and medical professionals about collectively addressing issues as they surfaced. Today, our topic is Permaculture Can Make Our Future Better. And we're talking with Dr. Bob Randall. Dr. Randall has a PhD in food systems anthropology from Cal Berkeley, taught at the University of Houston and at Rice, and has nearly 40 years here as both a paid community organizer and volunteer, helping to improve food access and quality. He worked 7 years for Interfaith Ministries Hunger Coalition, Community Gardening Program, then ran Urban Harvest for 14 years as the founding executive director. He had a hand in developing the first successful community gardens, school gardens, farmers markets, fruit tree sales, and have been teaching permaculture for almost 25 years. He has awards for this work from Target Hunger and St. Luke's Episcopal Health Charities, and is now a board officer of the Permaculture Institute of North America. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Nice to see you.
Now, some people have maybe not even ever heard the word permaculture, and they're not familiar with it. So before we get into all the specifics about it, can you kind of give us just an overview of what it is?
Certainly. Well, permaculture is short for permanent culture. Relatively unknown, misunderstood. Some people think it's some kind of gardening because we certainly believe in food. But it's really a 50-year-old effort to figure out how we can have sustainable cultures. It came out of an Australian university, and it's all over the planet at this point.
Wow.
But what we think is that if you make a decision that's important, it needs to use sustainable principles, ones that we know are sustainable. And what we know is that a lot of natural areas lasted for thousands of years. And a lot of indigenous societies lasted very long periods of time without any sort of major problem. So we got principles from those two places, and then there is also this other thing. There's been a lot of efforts in permaculture now for almost 40, 50 years, in lots of places around the planet. And so we've got that data, and I should say we're not opposed to new tech if it doesn't violate things. So we're not against that. We're not against air conditioning or anything else like that. The basic thing, though, is that you asked about what it is and why people don't understand it. You minimum need to take 72 hours of this to get any kind of real understanding of it. And so what I'm going to do tonight is, 45 minutes, an hour. It's not going to really work.
The condensed version.
So, yeah.
So it kind of sounds like an ecological utopia of sorts. So what takes this from being kind of a really interesting thought experiment to being something that we really need to think about, and that's something that's really compelling in today's world?
Yeah. Well, what I like, I'm an anthropologist. We take a long view of things, okay? And really each of the last 500 years, there have been major problems that have hit us on this planet. And really the 15th to 17th centuries, we got a tremendous European colonization of much of the world. And in fact, when I was born in 1942, much of the world were still colonies of European powers, and not to mention Puerto Rico and the Philippines in the case of the United States. And the British alone at one point had 80% of the world's surface in colonies, the British.
Wow.
So so that resulted in a lot of efforts to combat that. The American Revolution, all sorts of stuff like this, and the effects of it are still ongoing. Then we got the 18th century, and there was all this stuff about human rights in France and the United States, and important stuff. Representational democracy, combating autocracy, monarchs, all sorts of stuff like that. And that's ongoing, just like the anti-colonial method, that's going on still. And then you got the 19th century, and people said, well, what about economic rights? So we got labor rights, child labor laws, ideas about food justice, housing justice, you name it. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in that direction, and that's ongoing. And certainly we're a long way from figuring that out too. Yeah, so plenty of stuff to think about, but you asked me about compelling. But the point, what I make is that these efforts to combat colonialism and autocracy and human rights and economic rights are not utopian. They are hard to do, though. And what the 20th century gave us was a new problem, and that's the fact that Homo sapiens are now able to destroy large parts of the planet. We have military technologies, including nuclear war, that are very dangerous. You can see what they're doing to Ukraine at the moment, for example. And they're manufactured biocides, pesticides, all sorts of things that are widespread all over the place, and I might say in us. We have lots of this stuff in us. And natural agriculture fertility is dropped. Fresh water is going down. Forests and oceans are failing. And that, I haven't even mentioned climate change. So, which is going to make it all worse. So, point is, what permaculture says is that if you're going to make an important decision, it should sustain and regenerate biological systems. In permaculture, you make good decisions by simultaneously enhancing nature, making food systems regenerative, and creating human villages and cities that are enjoyable, less costly, and easier. And important decisions should intentionally, as a top priority, do this.
Well, it sounds like a no-brainer to me. I mean, yeah, let's save the planet. I mean, it's crazy. So why isn't this like everybody's talking about it and it's mainstream?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so it's what we have to do and what other people are thinking about when they make decisions. That's where it comes down to. In order to have a vibrant ecology, the trees, the fish, soil microbes, they all have to thrive, and our food system has to be regenerative. It can't be destroying nature. And if we're going to use energy and materials and money or labor, any of this stuff, we need to get the maximum benefits out of it we can. We can't be wasting this stuff. And we need to totally recycle our wastes. So if you don't do that, you're going to be in big trouble. And that means also not only individually, but our social systems. Mm-hmm. So for permaculture, we say you need to be really just like the people in previous centuries said, this is what we have to do. What you have to do is something like permaculture. Or the next decades and centuries are not going to be very good for people. Basically, permaculture is applied human ecology using principles that are known to work, and we think that's about the only real possibility of avoiding extinction as a species or near extinction. And that's why it's compelling, mm-hmm. But the question is, well, why not mainstream? And the reason is that people favor short-term goals. Profit being a big motivator, jobs, political power, people positioned for elections, things like this. Goodness knows what Russia's doing at the moment. Popularity is a reason people make decisions. Greed.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of transient motives like that of why I decided to do this rather than that, not how do we make our descendants' lives better.
Right.
And some of the poor decisions are just ignorance. Ignorance of things like permaculture. Mm-hmm. And lack of forethought. Just not thinking ahead or caring about this stuff. Who cares whether the polar bears are extinct, right? What difference does it make? Yeah. I don't know any polar bears myself. Now the dog next door, maybe, you know. And they're fossil social structures. We have a whole lot of procedures in this country that don't make ecological sense.
Right.
So another thing to say is it's only taught in a few universities and a few high schools. It's taught in some, but not many. And the transition to change, in the way we're talking, could cost you some money.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's understandable why it's not mainstream. And I think basically Declaration of Human Rights several centuries ago was not mainstream, and even then it didn't apply to all kinds of people. So what I'm saying is that you have to move in the direction of future care. Mm-hmm. And permaculture is a way to do it, the best way I've ever run into. That's broadly why it's mainstream and why that needs to change.
You've made it really clear why it's not only compelling but imperative that we do this. So I understand the concept. So how does it actually work in real life?
Yes. Well, as I said, it's a 72-hour course. And that's just the basic class. But anyway, we have what we call a core directive, which is that what you want is permanent culture. That's what we want. And there are 3 core ethical principles that we think that you have to consider all the time in making important decisions, or you aren't going to get sustainability.
Okay.
So those 3 are people care, earth care, fair share. That's the short form of that. Obviously, all 3 of those, earth care, fair share, and people care, are all big topics.
Right.
But then there are 1 to 2 dozen design principles, which I'll illustrate a couple later on, that we use all the time, that we think you need to use when you're making decisions. But if they violate those three ethical principles, it's not permaculture. People care, earth care, fair share. Going to buy a house, going to buy a car, going to do anything, going to elect a president. It doesn't really make any difference. Those are not there, you got trouble.
It just kind of sounds like an ethical lens to look at whatever you're doing through.
Yes, yes. And that's broadly what permaculture is a way of making sustainable decisions in a way that'll likely get you there. So what we think is that if they aren't simultaneously followed, you're not going to get there. One of the things to say is that permaculture is widely adaptable to all sorts of situations. A lot of people think of it as something kind of gardening, and the reason is that the first essence of it in the early 70s was aimed at agriculture, how to get a sustainable agriculture. But it then realized very quickly that these principles followed all over the place to everything. So why widely adaptable? I mean, a trip across town, you could decide how to do that using permaculture. You could rehab a kitchen. You could build a building or a farm or a garden or a park or even a city using permaculture principles. And I'm sure they would all work much better. And when I say very wide, you can use it to build organizations, including nonprofits, is what we did at Urban Harvest, churches, businesses, and I like to add even government agencies. Yeah, so that's broadly.
That's great. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, you have nearly 40 years as both a paid community organizer and as a volunteer to help improve food access and quality. So I can only imagine all that you've seen in that time that has helped create this passion for what you're doing. So talk about that, and maybe also some of your experiences growing up that made you inclined to work in this field.
There's a lot of stuff. I just turned 80. I just turned 80 in April. Nancy's following me in June. So anyway, we've seen a lot, any of us 80-year-olds. I mean, Roosevelt was president when I was born. So, I mean, anyway. So I grew up in a small town of Princeton, New Jersey.
Oh, New Jersey, okay.
And we moved there in 1946 when I was 4. Some of the 2,000 adults there when I entered first grade included Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer and a whole lot of refugees from Nazism. It's a very unusual town to grow up in. We weren't faculty, by the way, but some of my friends had lived in Los Alamos.
Oh, really?
And I don't know why. These were kids, mind you. I have no idea what they were doing in Los Alamos. They didn't seem to want to divulge that. But there is only one industry in Los Alamos in 1946. So anyway, my first year in Princeton was just 1 year after Hiroshima. So the 1940s and 50s had a lot of worries about nuclear war that were very scary to little kids like me. And dumping under desks, which I've seen discussed in the news lately, is not something you want little kids doing. I can tell you that. I still, well, anyhow, we won't get into that. But in college, I was doing a BS in chemistry, and I had summer jobs working in pesticide agriculture, doing research. And Rachel Carson came out with a book called Silent Spring.
Right.
And you read that and you say, you know, pesticides aren't the right way to be doing this. And so I started investigating this new field at the time of ecology. And then I went in a Peace Corps in West Africa, and I was in a rural village there. And it was some of the poorest people on the planet. And I ended up on the edge of the Sahara deciding to get into food systems anthropology. So that's how I got there. Now, moved to 1972, and I'm married to this one over here, Nancy Edwards, who is a returned Peace Corps from India. And we were in a small island between Mindanao and Borneo doing Cal Berkeley food systems research. And there was a lot there, of course, you said, you know, but the point is that the U.S. colony of the Philippines and the British colonies of India and Nigeria were really, really bad places for the people that lived there. They had unspeakable and totally heartbreaking poverty. I don't even want to get into that, but it just very hard to manage. And the thing about it is that when you get to the base of it, there are ecological and economic things going on that mean that their future was not going well and would not go well. And not only that, it's linked to our future. Another story for another day, but anyway, so we taught in several places, landed in Houston, and finally, basically, both of us just wanted to work on problems here rather than go on teaching this stuff indefinitely. And so permaculture gave us a way to look at the 20th century's problems, which seemed to me to overshadow even all those other awful problems. And it's an ethical way to go after sustainability using proven design principles, which as a scientist, it appeals to me. So anyway, that's basically how I got here.
That is really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, earlier you described how permaculture design principles are widely applicable and flexible, from a garden to a park to a kitchen rehab to government agencies. So could you give us some other examples of permaculture reasoning and perhaps another example of how you could explain how it could be used in everyday life and on land?
Yeah. Yes, we do a lot of that in permaculture design class. But here, I'm going to give you a couple of examples so you can see how it works. And that's the best I can do here. But those of you who traveled here, you had your reasons. And you might think about the fact that you used fossil fuel to get here. Even if you had an electric car, even if you rode by train or bike, because the roads and trains and bikes are all made with fossil fuel. Even the Tesla's made with fossil fuel. Pieces of it are. And certainly you should consciously try to reduce your impact in any way you can, and we drive a Prius and we'll probably get an electric if we ever get another car, but basically those conservation efforts are great, but that's not a full permaculture perspective. What you want to do when you do something like take a trip here to the church or take a trip wherever you take a trip to, is obtain multiple benefits. The permaculture term would be yields, but benefits, yields, functions, get a lot of functions, get a lot of benefits out of any activity you spend labor on, materials on, time on, money on, or energy. Materials, energy, labor, money, time. You should be getting a lot of uses out of whatever you're doing. So let me give you an example. In nature, trees in forests have very few resources. You know, they've got air and soil and water, but they get maybe a dozen things at least positive done. So one way of, and they recycle all their wastes. Mm-hmm. So one thing would be if we just tried to be as good as a tree at this, if we were just as smart as a tree, you know, when we're doing a car trip or anything else, or build a park, anything like this, we should be trying to do that. So that's one way of saying it. So how many benefits could you get out of a trip to the church? So I tapped into Nancy, who comes to this church way more often than I do, I might add, and what you could get out of it. So in addition to coming here for whatever your purpose was, you could do an errand. Mm-hmm. You could pick up another person, maybe you did, or you could organize a carpool for everyone going to your part of town. Or you could meet a friend at the talk and make a friend, or make a friend. You could bring a food donation, drop it off. You could apply something you learned here to benefit you or others. You could email a link to this talk or to someone who wasn't here. And any of you could probably think of other things you could get out of it. So the idea is to consciously pack as many benefits as you can into what you're putting an effort into. In other words, we're being more frugal with what we've got.
Mm-hmm. And smarter in how you use it.
Yes, it's it's why we call it design. We're using principles to plan thoughtfully. So permaculture doesn't give you a canned answer about how to plan a trip. It doesn't say you should do this or do that or the other thing. It says you should use the ethical goals and the design principles, one of which is get multiple benefits. Another one is, you know, renewable wastes. But get in the habit of using resources wisely. So the other point is that should not just be true for each of us individually, but also for organizations and for governments. Mm-hmm. So it's a broader perspective than simply, you know, banks should do that, so on.
So it sounds like, boiling it down, it's a way to get more benefits using fewer resources. So what can I do in my house to do that?
Yes, well, that is the good example of that is something that Nancy and I did because I'm more aware of that, mm-hmm. But you can find zillions of examples. We installed rain tanks at our house, 3 of them back around 2000.
I'm sorry, a rain what?
A rain tank, a cistern,
tank. I'm sorry.
Big metal things that catch rainwater. We did this in about 2003, so here's the reason why. We had this thing called Tropical Storm Allison. Some of you may have been here when that happened, some of you may not, but Tropical Storm Allison was in 2001. We have a 1,200 square foot house, and 16,000 gallons of water approximately came off our roof in 3 days. And the surrounding yard that we own had about 130,000 gallons fall on it that didn't fall on the roof. And we're fairly close to the divide between the two bayous, so all the water goes downhill from there. We're not getting flooded by some bayou. But our foundation got water around it, as you would imagine, water pouring off, and some of it entered the corner right under where I actually thought about this talk. And so permaculture design would say, well, here we're not getting any use out of this water, and it's causing us all sorts of trouble, and so on. So 2 months later, we hadn't had a drop of rain. It was summertime now, and I'm out there watering newly planted fruit trees with city water.
Yeah.
Now something's wrong here. You know? Anyway, if we put the water in tanks,
Right.
what would have happened is that we would have filled up 4,800 gallons of water, and the excess would have gone out through overflow valves and downhill away from the house. So we wouldn't have flooded. We would have had 4,800 gallons of water to water plants with that the city didn't have to pay for and ship to me, and I didn't have to pay the water bills. And I wouldn't have gotten flooded, and I wouldn't have had to replace the floor and all the rest of it. And so the other piece to that is that we had this thing called Harvey. You may have heard of that. But it showed up in, 2018, was it? Something like that. And we got 50% more water than during Allison. We got 36 inches of rain, and we got it in 4 days instead of 3, but we didn't have any flooding because we had done this. And in the 10 years since we paid off the cisterns with city water that we didn't have to spend money on, in the last 10 years, since 2012, we have had free water. I used some today, 2022. So amazing stuff. So one last thing to say about this is that using rainwater is a classic permaculture example of using a sector energy. This stuff arrives on my roof. I didn't ask for it, and I'm using it. What we do, sector energy is a free or low-cost resource that you can use productively if you can only figure out how. There are lots of these things found in nature. The land around you is one example of that. And another one is wind. What is wind good for? Well, it can cool you on a patio, or it can blow off your roof. So what we do with sector energies is we design around them. If we want a mild wind to cool us, we design to get the wind where we want it. And if we don't want a heavy wind wrecking anything, we design to defect it or block it or whatever, including hurricanes. You could slow them down with the right trees.
Oh, wow.
So it's not, so what we do with sector energies, if we like them, we encourage them, we collect them, we use them. And if we don't like them, we deflect them or block them or absorb them or do something with it. So we do an analysis of that. And metal rain tanks, just as another example here we're talking about, they don't just catch water. Remember, we want multiple use. What else can they do? Well, they can block hurricane force winds from our screen porch. They're pretty darn strong, and they've got a lot of water in them in a hurricane. And the other thing they can do is they give off heat during cold weather so they can protect a lemon. So what does that mean? What it means is that the house gets benefits from the tanks. That is wind protection. The tanks get benefit from the house, namely water. Yeah. And the connection between the tanks and the house benefits the lemon and the fruit. So that's permaculture thinking on a piece of land.
That's fascinating. I grew up in Kentucky, and all our cisterns are buried in the ground. So I didn't think about them helping to protect the house and that type of thing.
Yeah, and when you're going to install this, you say, well, do I have some place where I can put it? Yeah. And if I do, placement is something we can control. So by placing it here, can I get something? Then if I placed it over here, I wouldn't. And I should say that so we're getting benefits out of connections themselves, not just from what we're doing, but also connecting things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I might add that permaculture is really an effort to block ecocidal energies across the planet. So at a global...
That's a great word. Explain to everybody what you mean by ecocidal.
Ecocidal is just the destruction of ecosystems, including the world ecosystem. So that's the term, and there are a lot of words like that. Ethnicide's another one. I mean, it's just
It's interesting. The UU Church in Dallas built a new RE wing, and I think it was one of the first LEED certified buildings in the Park Cities there. And they built a tank, a water tank, to gather all that water, just as you say, and water all the grass. So you don't have to buy it. It just totally makes sense.
And it's a backup function for your toilets if the city water supply ever collapses, which it could if the wrong thing happened to the pumping station. So, so that's an example. And,
so that leads me to ask, how can we make all this stuff work at a church?
Yeah, now I'm not going to really tell you how to make it work at a church. You guys are the specialists in that. And but I did do a lot of work at Urban Harvest, and I'm on the board of 2 nonprofits at the moment. And so it's what you would do in any nonprofit is very similar in a lot of ways. So anyway, so churches have their own free or low-cost sector energies. And yeah, they have all these things we were just talking about, wind and sun and rainwater, and you can certainly use them. But as a nonprofit organization, they also have other sector energies like supporters and organizational allies. And supporters, I use the term supporter to mean staff. I often use the adjective hard-working staff. Volunteers, board members, donors, they're all super valuable in a nonprofit. And I was an ED of a nonprofit for 14 years. I know what valuing supporters means. Right. And what do they provide? They provide skills, knowledge, funds, labor, larger access to diverse communities and venues. You've got all this stuff in supporter. There's a northwestern came out with this thing called asset-based community development, that each person has a lot of the stuff that they can contribute to an organization. Even poorest people on the planet have got lots of assets. And so if you figure out how to use it, you've got a lot of possibility there. There are a lot of resources is what I'm trying to say. Not just rainwater, you've got supporters. And so the question is, how do you benefit from these supporters' energies in your nonprofit? How do you collect them, supporters? How do you retain them? And that's a design problem, and I would call it a permaculture design problem. So one of the ways you do that is you take a detailed analysis of the benefits that donors, volunteers, and staff want. Like, staff probably like vacations and medical benefits, for example. I mean, just as an example, I was an ED. So your programs should get many benefits. And some of them, let's see, I just lost the train. So. Yeah, so you're trying to get many benefits out of your programs, and they need to be ones that your supporters, current supporters and potential supporters, want.
Oh, okay.
That's what I was trying to say in my. You might ask this question: what are the possible benefits of church participation? Now, I was at Interfaith Ministries for 7 years, and I spent quite a bit of time in different congregations. So, how about community, ritual, education, identity, purpose, emotional support, safety, income, staff at least, income, charity, or other missions, whatever's in the mission statement of the thing. And there's probably more than that. I mean, I would never suggest I would have, if you did this across your congregation, you would doubtlessly find many more. Probably have if you've looked at this. So, the question is, how would you do that with your resources? Your resources are your supporters, including your staff. And as you're probably well aware, staff is often hard-pressed to do stuff. So what you want to do is get multiple benefits out of each program. That's what you want to do. One way to do that is to connect your programs so that each benefits the other, just like the house and the rain cistern. The connection itself should bring benefits. I mean, ideally.
Sure.
We're not, who knows? But unless you ask the question, you are not likely to get a good answer. And so what I'm saying is that clever design can engage supporters long-term. And in my opinion, for nonprofits, supporters are really the key thing. They're almost like profits in a business or something. That if you can't really increase your supporters, your capability to do things falls. So I certainly don't have any way to tell you how to do this. What I can tell you is that if you use permaculture ethics and permaculture designs, you get better benefits with less wasted resources. And I won't claim that this will get you sustainability in the centuries ahead, but it will be more sustainable than the alternative.
Exactly.
So I certainly simplified this a ton. Dozen or more design principles. I actually use about 22, but
Oh, wow.
some people use 12. I mean, depends on how you phrase it and stuff like this. But if you deliberately try to get increases in food, nature, and livable communities all at the same time, you will end up with significant and lasting satisfactions. That's the key thing. So you need to be thinking like that, and everybody else does. So that's best I can come up with on terms of explaining how that works.
Well, this is an incredible amount of information to take in and think about. It's
Yeah.
absolutely fascinating. But like you said, at a bare minimum, you need 72 hours to scratch the surface. So I'm sure people are interested in learning more about how to do this. So how would they go about doing that?
Well, there are lots of, as anybody who's been on the web at all knows, there are lots of videos and websites and even wikis, I understand, on what permaculture is. And there are books and journals, but I don't think you can learn permaculture looking at videos and any more than you could learn any number of other things on the web. You can learn something. But what you need to do is take the Permaculture Design Certificate course, which is called the PDC by us. And that's a 72 to 100 hours, depending on where you take it. And there are online courses that you can take. For busy people, that may be their best approach. But they have to be taught by someone with a permaculture teaching diploma like I have. Because some of them aren't, and some of them are not very good at what they're doing, and the permaculture diploma teaching diploma means pretty much that people have been vetted and know what they're doing. And if COVID is not too much of a problem, you could travel somewhere for about 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks. You could go to Oregon or somewhere and study almost every day, almost the whole time, and get it in 10 days, 12 days, whatever, and have a lot of camaraderie with a whole bunch of people you never met before.
Plus, you get to spend 2 weeks in Oregon.
Yeah, I mean, something like that. I mean, COVID has put a damper in everything, as we know, but so that's one approach, and we may end up doing something like that in the summer here at some point if we get enough funding. But we teach the PDC on Sunday afternoons mainly at Urban Harvest here in Houston. So it lasts a lot longer than 10 days, but on the other hand, it's 4 hours or so at a go. And you don't have to pay for travel or food, mostly. We have a couple of out-day excursions to a permaculture farm and stuff like that.
Does Urban Harvest have a website people can go to?
Yeah, urbanharvest.org has a website. We teach it's taught in 5 modules. The first module is the introduction to Sundays in the afternoons, and that is required in order to take any of the other 4 modules. And so it's taught in late September, and then it repeats again in late January. And the fall course is a module that is on food, gardens, and farms, and its design. The winter course is on green homes and communities, eco-housing, stuff like that. Renewable energy stuff, eco-villages, you name it, co-housing. And the spring class is on the ecological crisis and restoring nature. And that covers the full Permaculture International curriculum.
Oh, wow.
And then if you do those 4 modules, you can do the design tutorial, and that means you pick out a topic that you're interested in, whatever it is, and design it permaculturally in about 12 hours. So it's just conceptual, it's rarely really implementing it. But then you present it and teach us all what you know about it. So that's what we do for the basic course. There are also more advanced classes that you can take, and there are diplomas that you can take, which I've got 2 of. But then we have a lot of specialty diplomas as well. So that's what we do.
You mentioned something about international.
Yeah.
So where are some of the places that this is really catching on? And
I have told people, just pick a place in the world and type in Bulgaria and permaculture, or Morocco and permaculture, or you name it, China and permaculture, Waco and permaculture. I'm not joking.
yeah.
It's all over the place, but it's not the predominant, ideology
Sure.
or anything of anywheres. It started in Australia, and there's a lot of activity in Australia, but it's every state. I'm on the board of Permaculture Institute of North America, and we have board members in Panama, Toronto, Pittsburgh, New York City, Ithaca, New York, Seattle area, Washington State, Oregon, Colorado. I think I maybe covered it all. And Texas. Oh yeah, Texas.
Oh, and Texas.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I'm saying is there's permaculture activity
That's
everywhere.
great. Yeah, I was just trying to get a sense of if it's all over the place, and it sounds like it is.
Yeah, and it's been in Britain even longer than in the United States.
Oh, really?
So it's just it makes sense, and it's scientifically accurate. It's,
Right.
it's applied human ecology based on principles that have, as best we can tell, have been shown to work.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway.
Well, this is absolutely fascinating. I can't thank you enough for sharing what you know.
Yeah.
Like you said, a very condensed version of what you know about this fascinating topic.
Yeah.
So, Dr. Bob Randall and Permaculture, and thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure to do it.